just dive right in. Obviously, if anyone else is joining, they will have to come in late. So I want to talk, before we talk about specifics to holiday wine pairings, I want to talk a little bit about how I kind of view pairing. And as a longtime sommelier and wine director, it's obviously something that I've thought about a lot. And so I like to think about these sort of corresponding components of pairing in food and wine. So in food, we have at least these 6 components to consider, and there are certainly more. But specifically, I'm talking about sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami or savoriness, and then fat. And in wine, they don't have exact analogs, of course, but some of them do. And that would be residual sugar, salinity in the wine, acidity, bitterness or phenolic character, tannins, and then glycerol and dry extract. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these as we discuss some pairing options. But it's important to know that these do kind of align. But as is the case when you're just thinking about creating a dish or a complete meal, part of the art of pairing is not necessarily always just putting like with like. And that's kind of one of the main things I wanted to emphasize here in this class, that there are kind of 2 philosophies when it comes to creating these food pairings. So the one of them is matching flavors, and the other is trying to find complementary flavors. And so matching flavors is what it sounds like. It's about figuring out what are the key flavor components in a dish, whether that's the main ingredient, the sauces, spices, garnishes, etc. And then finding wines that has a wine that has at least some, if not all, of those flavors. And this can be a really powerful way to do pairing. It can be really fun if you can find a wine that shares flavor characteristics with the dish that you're serving. The other way to go about doing it is as what I kind of call complementary pairing, which is really about finding those same key flavor components and then finding wines that offer a complement to or even a counterpoint to those flavors. So you can think about this the way sometimes if you're just thinking about in the world of food, or potentially something like designing a cocktail or something like that, we tend to find that the most interesting and complex foods have a number of different flavor elements which work together. And one of the fun things about having wine with food is that sometimes wine can be the sort of condiment, the complement to the dish, and in doing so heighten the experience. And conversely, of course, in some cases, food can do the same with wine. Food can kind of act to complete something about the wine that might otherwise be lacking. And sometimes one of the great examples of this that I like to talk about is a really classic fun pairing that is basically, if you think about something like fried chicken, and where you've got fattiness, you've got umami or savory character, and you've obviously got saltiness. And one of the great pairings with that is champagne or other sparkling wines, because it delivers 2 things that the fried chicken lacks. One is it delivers sourness or acidity. Sparkling wine tends to be very high in acid, which makes it generally very versatile when it comes to pairing. And also that acidity goes really well with the saltiness in the fried chicken. And it also has a sort of lightness to it. So if you think about a textural component being distinct from the texture of fried chicken, that's the idea of a sort of complementary pairing. Whereas a more matching kind of pairing would be looking for maybe a more full-bodied white wine that maybe also has a little bit of a sense of brightiness to it. So you might be looking for barrel-aged Chardonnay from somewhere like in Sonoma Coast or something like that, which can be a little salinity, but also some richness, just as one example. And so I'll give another here too, because I think this helps kind of emphasize what I'm talking about. Here again, talking chicken. Chicken is kind of one of those ones that when we're talking pairing concept, it's really easy to talk about because chicken is kind of a neutral protein, so it doesn't necessarily take on a ton of, it can go in a lot of different directions. So roast chicken is one of my favorite dishes to make too. Maybe that is why it's in this class. So the matching approach to looking at this might say, as I just was sort of talking about with fried chicken, you might look for a more full-bodied white wine that's going to offer some richness, some savory note as well, because again, you're getting that sort of umami character from the chicken. So both Chardonnay, a white blend from the Southern Rhone, or at least in that style, or white Rioja. Conversely, with roasted chicken in particular, I love to think of something as a complementary pairing that's going to bring a sort of match the savoriness of the dish, but bring a kind of herbal character. So Vermentino from Sardinia, Gruner Veltliner from Austria. And this idea is, again, as I say on the slide here, the idea really is to interact with the food and sort of change the overall set of flavors that you're working with, or at least augment them. And this can, I think, be really fun. It can be really delicious. It is a little bit potentially, I guess, riskier, or at least more, you can sometimes go wrong, as is the case with trying to do anything that involves combining flavors. Sometimes you think in your head it will work, and then you taste it and it doesn't. I've done that before for sure. And fortunately for me, in restaurant settings, usually you have a wide range of wines to work with. So you try something that you think will work and it doesn't. There's always another option. At home, that's a little bit trickier, but it certainly can be done as well. So we'll talk a little bit about holiday meals and just a few things about that before we get into some specific pairing ideas. So I think that I'm going to talk more about maybe non-2020 holidays, because I think for a lot of us, they're going to be a little different. Talk about both. So I think one thing that's always a challenge with holiday meals in most normal years, if you're having a larger gathering, would be one thing is you're probably gonna have a lot of different dishes on the table. I think for most of us, whether it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever, one of the elements of those meals is abundance, a lot of food on the table at the same time. So it's not always super easy to just have one wine. So part of what we'll talk about here too is some different ideas, so that if you want to have multiple options on the table that might work for both different dishes, but also of course different kinds of wine drinkers. Because if your gatherings are anything like mine have been in the past, you've got people who like, everything from sweet wine to light, crisp whites to full-bodied reds and all that. So you have to kind of be at least a little bit prepared. That said, though, for most of us, things that what we're eating is going to at least largely revolve around things, meat, fat, salt, and dairy. And so that's a lot of what I think about when I think about the key components here. And so, like I said, you can kind of work on pairing with a main dish, especially if you're doing something that is more of a centerpiece, whether it's prime rib or something like that. Or if, again, the focus is more a whole range of wines, a whole range of dishes, then you can also, kind of focus on something that's going to be more broadly applicable than something that's designed to pair with just one dish. And then we have this last question that I come across a lot, which is, kind of if you are the kind of person who has a little bit of a wine collection, or you just feel like, do I want to go out and get some more expensive bottles? Sometimes the holidays are a great time to do that. I sometimes find it to be the time when I'm least interested in doing that. I'm not able to give the wine I'm drinking all that much attention in these, kind of classic holiday settings. I'm talking to friends, family, etc. And additionally, to be totally candid, there are people who come to various holiday meals of mine that wouldn't know the difference if I served them a special wine or not. And so I might prefer to save those bottles for an occasion where I'm with people who will be interested in something special. So something to consider, of course. This go around, for most of us, we're probably going to be having smaller gatherings. I think in some ways this makes it simpler. You have fewer people, probably fewer dishes, so you don't have to consider as many variables. There's also a kind of an interesting opportunity here to maybe narrow more specifically in on what the few of you who are sharing a meal really like. That said, the flip side is, it's harder to open more things unless you are really planning on not being productive the next day, which, hey, I mean, I've been there too. So no judgment in this space. I'll start with my general suggestion to everyone. What I am drinking, I'm drinking some Cremant de Limoux, rosé specifically. As I said at the outset, I think sparkling wine is, besides always a wine to drink every day, basically, is great holiday wines because great holiday wine for a variety of reasons. The biggest being, of course, it has a sort of celebratory air to it in the first place, but also, as I mentioned when I was talking at the beginning about the pairing idea with fried chicken, the acidity in almost all sparkling wines is going to be a really natural counterpoint to meals that are often pretty rich and heavy. So whether you're talking traditional method, bubbles like champagne, Cremant, Cava, domestically produced or from other places, that can be really a nice option. And then the other thing that's kind of fun is, you could even consider having a couple of different kinds of sparkling wine on the table. You might want to have a Blanc de Blanc champagne for something that's going to offer a little bit more richness and creaminess. And you might want to have a nice bright sort of tart fruited rosé sparkling wine, and maybe even a slightly like marginally off dry Prosecco or something like that, where there's a little more sweetness. That could be something that not only goes with the meal, but could carry through dessert, should that be your thing. So always a great suggestion, I think, but not the only one I'm going to offer, of course, because not everyone likes sparkling wine, and sometimes we just want different things. That said, here's another selection of kind of a lot of what else is out there. I also will say, I'll give my little 1 minute plug for some Pétillant Naturel, or Pet Nat as it's often called, which, as opposed to the other styles I've mentioned here, the champagne or traditional method and the Charmat method, involves a sort of one single fermentation that happens in the bottle. And these wines can have a really kind of profound savory character to them because of their extended lees contact and the sort of lack of, usually the fact that they're very dry. And so that can be really fun too, especially like with something that might be savory salty, like ham or something like that in particular. I think could be a really fun note, because they often also bring a fruit character. They're savory in a way and dry, but also often have bright fruit character if they're on the younger side, which they typically are. And so that goes really well with something that's really kind of salty and meaty like ham. Not that it can't work with turkey or beef or whatever. So to come to the Thanksgiving meal, I think it's, again, it's like Thanksgiving turkey, if your turkey is decent, I should say, is a meal where I would look for, you're dealing with a bird that is more flavorful than chicken, hopefully, if you cook it well, but still isn't going to be all that strong, and has a little bit of a gamey note. So to me, it makes, when I think about what works well with gaminess, there are kind of a couple of different directions you can go. And then, of course, you also have the mashed potatoes and gravy, if you're like me, which is maybe more the point than the turkey, frankly. So I do think we want a wine here if we're looking at a pairing that's going to be rich in body, because something too light is going to kind of disappear underneath all of that, but isn't necessarily something that's going to be too, we still want something that's going to have some brightness to it, because I think it can be a little bit overwhelming if not. So with matching, I often like to go with these sort of more full-bodied white wines, like I sort of described when matching with chicken. And I'll give a couple of examples here in a moment. But the other option, if you want to stick in the white realm, that I also have come to really be enamored with, is with like aromatic white varieties. So something like a Viognier or even potentially Gewürztraminer, and it's to work with the gaminess of the turkey. So if you're more of a dark meat person like I am, it's not as intense as duck, obviously, or goose or something like that, but the gaminess can come through on a turkey, especially if you're having like a heritage breed or a smaller bird or something like that can be a little more intensely gamey sometimes. And I find that the florality that you get from something like a Viognier or Gewürztraminer can be a nice way to kind of play with that gaminess, pairing aromatic whites with gamey foods, whether they're, duck, or whether it's venison, well, not venison, I'm sorry, whether it's duck or whether it's like organ meats or things like that, can be a really classic idea. And then the complementary pairing idea is, I like to think about wines that are kind of like cranberry sauce, right? Like you think about why cranberry sauce works with turkey. And caveat, I don't like cranberry sauce very much, but a lot of people do. And the reason is that you're getting fruitiness for sure, but also this real kind of tart acidity that works really well and really well as a sort of contrast to the somewhat to the richness, and frankly, in all honesty, for a lot of us, probably kind of the blandness of turkey. I like to think of myself as a good cook, and sometimes it's hard to get turkey to be tasty. Especially if it's a large bird, especially if you are not doing something fun like deep frying it. It just can be hard to get a lot of flavor there. And notice, everyone, I am seeing your questions. I will get to them after we wrap up here, so I promise I will get to them. So I mentioned before, though, I really love full-bodied white wines, and I think they are super versatile wines in a lot of dining settings, not just holiday meals. And I think that the reason for that is that a lot of people have, well, they have two preconceived notions about white wine. A lot of people think that white wine is basically one of two things. They think it's either really oaky, kind of classically American Chardonnay, or they think it's really bright, high acid, sort of grapefruity New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And if you don't like either of those styles, or even if you don't like one of those styles, then white wine will sometimes miss the mark. I think we also just have a general conception, unfortunately, that white wine is not like, it's not the serious wine. You know, it's the wine you drink before you drink the serious wine, which is always red. That is a really modern idea. In some sense, it's not the way that people have thought about white wine traditionally. And I would encourage you to, if you're interested at all in white wines, to move past that idea. I drink a lot more white wine than I do red wine most of the year. Even in the winter, I still think probably my wife and I drink almost equal amounts of white and red. And so some examples that are going to give you this sort of richness, this body, this texture without being too, with having some acidity but not overwhelming, and not showing a lot of oak character if you don't like that. The first would be Marsanne Roussanne blends. You can often find those in the Rhone Valley in France. So appellations like Gros Hermitage or even Hermitage, even a Côte de Rhone Blanc can be a really nice option. White Rioja, so a Blanco Rioja, which is going to be made from a variety called Villora, or as it's known in most of the rest of Spain, Macabeo. And then Soave from northern Italy in Veneto, which of course for some of us has a bad reputation because there was a lot of it that was made and it was really cheap and kind of crappy. But the really good Soave, in particular Soave Classico, which is from the sort of historic production area, can be really nice as well. Caracante, which is a lot harder to find, but is a white from Sicily, from the slopes of Mount Etna. You'll see it as Etna Bianco. And then also white Bordeaux, which is actually usually a Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend. And this is the one on this list that does typically show a little bit of oak character, but I find that it works really well in this specific blend to add a little bit of body and texture along with the Semillon to Sauvignon Blanc. So you still have some of that freshness and brightness, but a nice kind of nutty honey tone, as well as just, again, some body to the wine. So we'll talk brief interlude, my holiday, besides Thanksgiving, of course, which is Hanukkah. And one of my favorite things to talk about here, which is latkes and sour cream plus applesauce, because to me, it has such an obvious and fun pairing combo that I really enjoy. But it also offers us some really kind of nice insight into some other options. So the first, so I love this with Loire Valley Chenin Blanc. And for me, it's like, the reason for that is that one of the dominant flavors in aromas in Loire Valley Chenin Blanc is often kind of like essentially applesauce. So to me, it's like this great option of like, I don't love applesauce on my latkes. I'm like, just give me the latke and sour cream person. And so I drink my Loire Valley Chenin Blanc, Vouvray or otherwise, sometimes even with just like a little bit of residual sugar. And it's like having applesauce, except I don't have to eat applesauce, which makes me happy. And here, of course, we have a little bit of the same kind of set of flavors with, potato plus dairy, as we do with mashed potatoes. But of course, the sort of fried nature is going to change the texture and the flavor profile, and introduces this kind of almost nuttiness that the Chenin Blanc works really well with. I also like this wine a lot with this pairing a lot with Chardonnay, but like a relatively crisp, so Chablis maybe, or even a wine from the southern part of Burgundy and the Mâconnais, where they're less likely to use a lot of oak, because I think here you do want more brightness than even you do with mashed potatoes, whereas mashed potatoes are really kind of creamy and rich and hopefully a little velvety. Latkes are crunchy and crispy, and so to me, I want a kind of a crunchier, crispier wine to go with those. And then talking about sort of this idea of Christmas ham, and I think about green bean casserole because like the few times I've been to a Christmas meal, that is often what's one of the things served with it. And so, as I said here, ham and pork in general has one benefit to it, which is like, it's pretty versatile. You can throw a lot of different kinds of wines at it. But the most important thing to be aware of to me is that usually it's really salty and sometimes sweet. And so you have to be prepared to work with those two elements. And so to me, especially if there's a little sweetness to your ham, it's actually really hard to put much red wine up against it because most red wines really don't work well with sweet foods. One day, maybe I will give my rant about not drinking red wine with chocolate, but today's not that day. And so one of the things that I love with this, and it's to me, it's just such a natural, is Lambrusco. So Lambrusco is a semi-sparkling red wine from Emilia-Romagna in the sort of north-central part of Italy. And it is, Emilia-Romagna is also like the cured pork capital of the world. If you like prosciutto, you probably have had it from Emilia-Romagna. It's also where Parmesan cheese is from. And it's the thing that you drink when you're there. And so Lambrusco has a number of different varieties in the broader Lambrusco family that go into making it. Sometimes you'll find a single variety as labeled on the label, but typically it's a blend of multiple different varieties. You can also find it as a rosé, but the red wines are more typical. There are a range of sweetnesses. They're not always super evident on the label, but I would avoid anything that says amabile. That's kind of like the sweetest category. They can be really tasty, but I don't think they're what you're going to want for a full meal. They're kind of a dessert-ish style of Lambrusco. These are going to be somewhat sparkling. And what I love about these is that they combine the sort of flavor profile that people are thinking about when they think about their sort of brighter, lighter red wines that are often recommended for this time of, for holidays like Gamay or Pinot Noir. But they have an additional kind of fresh quality to them because they're sparkling, but also because the varieties in the Lambrusco family are more tannic than things like Gamay or Pinot Noir. They do give you a little bit more tannin, which I find with something like ham, or even if you're having, certainly if you're having red meat, can be really nice because it does give you a little bit more of that counteracting note to the fat in the meat. So I find sometimes that Pinot and Gamay don't really have enough oomph to really stand up to ham or certainly to beef and even to maybe to turkey sometimes. And so this can be, Lambrusco I think can be a really nice option. And the other thing that's great about it is it's relatively inexpensive. I mean, I think you can find really great Lambrusco for under $20. And again, it's fun. It's probably different than what most of you have had for your Thanksgiving or Christmas meals. I'm going to talk about one other category of wine real quick and then wrap things up here. And this is kind of the other, if you want still red wine, because obviously lots of us are red wine lovers, and it's kind of the thing we want for these kinds of meals, or maybe all of them. And so I love, if I'm going to have still red wine with these kinds of meals, I tend to want something from this broader category. And that's going to be this sort of high acid, high tannin, light in color reds from Europe. So Nebbiolo from Northwest Italy is the most famous. It's the grape in Barolo and Barbaresco, if you're familiar with those. But it has some analogous varieties throughout the rest of Europe. So Norello Mascalese on Sicily, specifically on Mount Etna. Xinomavro from the northern part of Greece, Naousa. Kotzefali from Crete, a little hard to find, but out there a little bit in the market. And then Blaufränkisch from Austria. All of these offer that kind of tart red fruit profile, so cranberry, raspberry, cherry, but also often these kind of herbal, earthy notes. Some of them, like Nebbiolo, Norello Mascalese, and Xinomavro in particular, can be kind of floral as well, which can be really nice in this setting. But they're not just, to me, they have something that Pinot Noir, Gamay lack, which is the Pinot Noir and Gamay can offer you those things, but these wines can also offer you that tannin that works really well with these kind of meaty, fatty dishes that I just find that both Pinot and Gamay kind of come up a little bit short on, in my personal opinion. And these are delicious wines for lots of different meals too. You certainly don't have to limit them to the holidays, but they are something that I think people don't always think about. So I'm going to get to questions here in just a moment, but I just want to point out if you're interested in what I've been doing or have questions, the rest of the year looks like this. Talking Austria with my good friend Haley Black will be teaching that class with me on Saturday, and then Rioja on a week from Saturday on the 21st. And then 2 classes in December, Riesling on December 5th, and Fortified Wine, again, with Haley on the 19th. And then starting in January 2021, I'll be hopefully unveiling a list of classes by early December. The format will be just a tiny bit different, but basically the same as before. So I want to thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate it. It's really fun for me to get to do these. They're always really fast-paced for me, which is I talk fast no matter what, but I always feel like I'm kind of powering through these. So thank you all. If you have questions or comments, I'm going to pull up chat and get into these in just a moment. But please feel free to continue to ask questions if you have them. And so now let's see if I can pull up chat, and I will just work my way through here. I apologize. So let's see here. So yeah, so Galen, yeah, so I think I mentioned, yeah, the nice thing about these tart red fruits or red wines is that they do complement things kind of like cranberry sauce. So there you go. So the New York Times buttermilk brine turkey. I would have to look that recipe up a little bit to get a sense for kind of how it's cooked. I would say that probably if you're dealing with, if the sort of like I've made like buttermilk brine fried chicken a number of times, I think you kind of I'd be more inclined to lean towards a sort of medium to full-bodied white. I think that sort of additional sort of sour dairy character is really tough on red wines. So maybe that would be where I want one of those whites that I do think has a little more acidity. So maybe a white Bordeaux or potentially a white Rioja would be kind of the two I would look at there. Okay, cauliflower in cheese. What sparkling would I suggest? So this could be an opportunity to do something. I mean, cauliflower is kind of an interesting food in general when it comes to pairing because it doesn't have, to me, like a really obvious vegetal note. Like it's not like you're doing broccoli or something that's green and has those green notes, but it does still, to me, kind of, when I eat it, I still get a little bit of that sense. So I feel like I want a sparkling wine that's going to be maybe work a little with those vegetal flavors. So like, I mean, like an oddball that I have that I like is like you could get like a sparkling Ribolla Gialla from Friuli in northern Italy, where like Ribolla Gialla has a lot of that sort of, it like carries a nuttiness to it, but it has a little bit of like an alpine herbal tone to it as well. These kind of like wild herbs, and those can be really tasty. Sorry, I was running out of something there. And I mean, another option would be, I think another option could be if you want something that's a little bit on the lighter side to kind of cut through that, but it's going to work with those flavors. I also think like this would be a nice opportunity for something like a sparkling Riesling, where you're going to get a little bit of that floral tone and maybe a little bit of like more like a green apple character, but that I think could still kind of work with what's going on there. Let's see here. Other questions. What flavors describe gaminess? I mean, I think gaminess is kind of mostly about, I mean, it's always one of those things that's like hard to put to words, but it's a meatiness, but that has a sort of, I mean, I'm still just kind of talking around it elliptically, but wildness, that has a sort of, sometimes it has like more of a, like a metallic character to people that can be a little bit challenging. I mean, that's more often things like organ meats than it would be with something like duck, but those wines can have, or those foods can have a little bit of that. Yeah, it's like a tanginess almost, if that makes sense, I think. Let's see here, other questions. David, really quickly to clarify, when you mean the whole, I'll post the whole video probably tomorrow on my YouTube channel, so you'll be able to rewatch if you have questions. If there's a specific information that would be, if there's specific information that would be useful, let me know and I'll be happy to send along, but I will put the whole video up tomorrow. Chelsea, this is the variety. And then, yeah, Gary, to the point of not recommending turkey or not recommending Pinot Noir for turkey, it's not that it's a bad idea. I mean, I think it can be quite tasty. I just think that it's not, to me, the best. It's not a pairing that I love. And like I said before, I think one of the reasons is that turkey has this kind of, it has a sort of weight to it, I guess. And a sort of, I mean, again, depending on, of course, how you're preparing your turkey, how good the cook is, all that. If it's really, really well done, like properly done, then I think you might, some of what I'm going to say doesn't apply, but I myself struggle with turkey, so there's no judgment there. I think it's really hard to cook well, especially if it's not really tiny. And so I think that one of the problems I have with Pinot is that, with few exceptions, Pinot tends to be a little too light to work with it. And it also tends to be a wine that I actually find works better with like earthy vegetables than it does with meat. I mean, I've worked, done innumerable wine pairing dinners and tastings and stuff. And one of the hardest ones for me always is when we would do a wine dinner with a Pinot Noir producer, because there aren't a lot, they inevitably people expect and want, they expect red meat or something. Most people, if they're going to a dinner like that with red wine, and as I got more comfortable and familiar and capable of being like, and my chef did too, of saying, hey, we're not going to, we'll do what we think is best. We're not going to worry too much about, if someone is surprised that there's no red meat. And we would find that like the best pairings for us were with things like mushrooms, things like, hearty root vegetables like parsnips and things like that. Or even, if we wanted to do that, we would do, salmon or something like that, like a wood grilled salmon. And Pinot just, most Pinot does not have the tannin and the body to really work with meatier foods, in my opinion. It's delicious wine. It's one of my favorite varieties, and that's no criticism of it. I just don't find, I think people, because there's this whole middle ground of wine and red wine that isn't Pinot Noir and it's not full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's how most people, like with Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc and white, most people kind of define themselves on that axis because that's what a lot of us are familiar with. And there's that whole middle ground that isn't as full-bodied as like a classic American Cabernet Sauvignon, but has more body and more tannin and more depth than a lot of Pinot Noir, and can be really great for a lot of these meals where there's a lot of things on the table if you want red wine. So yeah, I would not tell you, I wouldn't say that's a terrible idea. I also think, as you said, it's what a lot of people recommend. And I didn't feel like this class would be all that useful to any of you if I just said, if I recommended the same exact wines that the New York Times or whomever recommends. Not that they don't know what they're talking about, but I have to have my own takes. So any other questions at this point or comments? I'd be happy to answer them. And like I said, I will be posting the video tomorrow, hopefully. So if you missed something or want to go back and revisit or see some of those suggestions, you should be able to do that. You can find, if you just search for Disgorged, I think you search for Disgorged wine on YouTube, you should be able to find it, or it's linked on, there's actually on my website, Disgorged Wine, there's a playlist of all of them on the website. So, all right, well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Like I said, hope to see you all in a class coming up sometime soon. And like I said, I'll have some news about what's coming in January quite soon. So stay tuned. Hope you all enjoy your holidays, eat well, drink well, and I really hope